A teacher smashes the phone of his black student, Michaela, in front of the entire class, sending shockwaves through the room. But the next day, the tables turn, and Michaela's ruthless revenge is something Mr. Warner never saw coming. What unfolds leaves him haunted, questioning everything he thought he knew about respect, discipline, and his own conscience. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Mr. Warner's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he marched toward his classroom, his jaw clenched tight. The morning sunshine streaming through the windows did nothing to brighten his mood. Principal Anderson's words from their meeting still rang in his ears. Times have changed, James. We need to focus more on understanding our students, not just disciplining them. Understanding? He scoffed, straightening his tie with sharp, angry movements. In his 30 years of teaching, discipline had never failed him. Structure and respect. That's what these kids needed, not coddling. His leather briefcase felt heavier than usual as he approached room 203. The polished nameplate on the door read, Mr. James Warner, English Literature, and seeing it usually filled him with pride. Today it just reminded him of Principal Anderson's disapproving frown. Too rigid, she'd said. Your methods are causing more harm than good. Mr. Warner's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the door. The empty classroom, with its neat rows of desks and spotless whiteboard, usually brought him comfort. But this morning, even his perfectly organized space couldn't calm the storm brewing inside him. He placed his briefcase on his desk with more force than necessary, causing his coffee mug full of pens to rattle. A stack of graded papers sat in his outbox, covered in red ink, corrections, criticisms, and stern notes about following proper format. Looking at them now, he felt a surge of defensive anger. I'm preparing them for the real world, he muttered to himself, settling into his chair. Someone has to maintain standards. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward first period. Mr. Warner pulled out his lesson planner, its pages crisp and meticulously detailed. Every minute was accounted for, every activity designed to maintain perfect order in his classroom. This was how it should be. This was what made him a good teacher. But for the first time in years, a tiny seed of doubt tried to take root in his mind. He pushed it away, focusing instead on his anger at being questioned. He'd show Principal Anderson. Today, he would run his classroom with even more precision, more discipline. He would prove that his way was the right way. The first bell would ring soon. Mr. Warner stood up, straightening his jacket and squaring his shoulders. His reflection in the classroom window showed exactly what he wanted to see. A figure of authority, someone who commanded respect, yet the tension in his face betrayed the conflict churning beneath his carefully maintained exterior. He walked to the doorway, prepared to greet his students with his usual stern expression. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid and imposing. This was who he was. This was who he needed to be. The distant sound of students beginning to fill the hallways made him stand even straighter, steeling himself for the day ahead. The students filed into the classroom silently, taking their seats with unusual care. Something about Mr. Warner's stance in the doorway, shoulders back, chin raised, eyes sharp, warned them that today was not a day for whispers or giggles. Mr. Warner closed the door with deliberate precision and strode to the front of the room. Without any greeting, he picked up his chalk and began writing on the board in his precise handwriting. The significance of symbolism in Lord of the Flies. Today, he said, his voice carrying a razor's edge, we will discuss how Golding uses symbols to represent the breakdown of civilization. He turned to face the class, his expression stern. I trust you've all completed the assigned reading. The silence in the room grew heavier. Students sat perfectly still, their textbooks open, pens poised over notebooks. Even Tommy Richards, who usually couldn't resist fidgeting, sat frozen in his seat. Mr. Warner launched into his lecture, each word precise and measured. His anger from the morning simmered beneath every sentence, making his usual authoritative tone even more intimidating. He paced between the rows of desks, his footsteps echoing in the quiet classroom. The conch shell represents order, he continued, his voice growing sharper. Without rules, without structure, society crumbles into chaos. Some might consider this harsh." He paused, Principal Anderson's words flickering through his mind. His jaw tightened. "But it is an undeniable truth." Suddenly, a cheerful electronic melody pierced the silence. The ringtone echoed through the classroom, shattering the tense atmosphere. Mr. Warner froze mid-sentence, his face flushing deep red. The students held their breath. The phone continued to ring, once, twice, 3 times, before someone finally managed to silence it. The damage was done. "Who?" Mr. Warner's voice came out as a near whisper, trembling with fury. "Is responsible for this disruption?" His eyes swept across the room like searchlights, examining each frightened face. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the shallow breathing of 30 terrified students. "I said," Mr. Warner's voice rose sharply, "who is responsible?" He stalked between the rows of desks, his gaze fierce and unrelenting. "This is a direct violation of classroom rules. Someone in this room has deliberately chosen to challenge my authority, and I demand to know who it is." The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Mr. Warner's eyes continued their relentless scan of the classroom, searching for any sign of guilt among the sea of downturned faces. In the heavy silence, a small hand slowly rose into the air. It belonged to Michaela Simpson, a quiet black 7th-year-old who always sat in the 3rd row, known for her perfect attendance and thoughtful essays. Her dark eyes were wide with worry as she gathered her courage. It's my phone, Mr. Warner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The classroom grew even more still, if that was possible. Several students held their breath, recognizing the dangerous glint in Mr. Warner's eyes as he turned toward Michaela's desk. In 3 long strides, he reached her. Without a word, he snatched the phone from her desk, its pink case decorated with small silver hearts. Michaela opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, but before she could speak, Mr. Warner raised the phone high above his head. With a swift, violent motion, he threw it to the floor. The crack of plastic and glass against tile echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Pieces of the phone skittered across the floor, coming to rest under nearby desks. Michaela stared at the broken pieces, her lower lip trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried desperately to hold them back. "This," Mr. Warner's voice boomed through the classroom, "is what happens when students disrespect my rules." He loomed over Michaela's desk, his face red with anger. A tear slipped down Michaela's cheek as she shook her head. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "I have made it perfectly clear since day one," Mr. Warner continued, his voice rising with each word, "that I will not tolerate disruptions in my classroom. Your blatant disregard for this rule is absolutely unacceptable." He jabbed a finger toward the broken phone. "Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to you, and to anyone else who thinks they can ignore my authority." Michaela's shoulders shook with silent sobs as more tears fell, but Mr. Warner showed no sign of softening. The other students sat frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and sympathy, as their teacher continued his public rebuke of their classmate. The classroom fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the soft scraping of a piece of broken plastic as it finished spinning to a stop under someone's desk. 28 pairs of eyes darted between their teacher and Michaela, who sat rigid in her chair, tears streaming silently down her face. Mr. Warner stood tall, his chest still heaving slightly from his outburst. A tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps he'd gone too far, but he pushed it away. No. This was necessary. This was how students learned respect. This was how order was maintained. He straightened his tie, a habit that always helped him feel more in control. "This is what happens when rules are broken," he said, his voice steady and cold. "Actions have consequences." Michaela's shoulders trembled as she tried to contain her sobs. Her hands remained tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles white from the effort. A few of her classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, wanting to comfort her but afraid to move. Mr. Warner felt another flicker of unease as he watched her struggle to maintain her composure. But again, he pushed the feeling aside. Hadn't Principal Anderson just questioned his methods this morning? Well, this would show everyone that he meant business. Students needed firm boundaries and strict consequences. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he announced to the class, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I expect complete compliance with my rules. No exceptions." He glanced at the clock on the wall. There were still 10 minutes left in the period, but he couldn't stand the tension anymore. "Class dismissed," he barked. "And remember what you saw here today. This is what happens when you challenge my authority." The students remained frozen in their seats as if afraid to move. A few cast sympathetic glances at Michaela, who kept her head down, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. "I said dismissed!" Mr. Warner's sharp voice made several students jump. They began gathering their things, moving as quietly as possible, like mice trying to avoid attracting a cat's attention. The next morning, Mr. Warner strode into his classroom with his usual air of authority. As the students filed in, his eyes automatically swept across the room, taking attendance in his head, a habit formed over decades of teaching. His gaze stopped at Michaela's empty desk, and an unexpected twinge of discomfort pricked at his conscience. He pushed the feeling aside and began his lesson, but the empty seat seemed to grow larger in his peripheral vision, like a silent accusation. Halfway through the class, while the students were working on their assignments, he heard whispered voices from the back row. "Did you hear about Michaela's mom?" Sarah Jensen's hushed voice carried just far enough for him to catch the words. Mr. Warner's hand paused mid-sentence as he was writing on the board. He kept his back turned, straining to hear more. "Yeah," came Tommy Martinez's equally quiet response. "She was in a really bad car accident yesterday morning. That's why the hospital was calling Michaela during class." The chalk in Mr. Warner's hand snapped in half. A few students looked up at the sharp sound, but he barely noticed. His throat had gone dry. "The hospital tried reaching her for hours," Sarah continued in a trembling whisper. "They couldn't get through because, well, you know." The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mr. Warner's stomach churned as the full impact of his actions crashed over him. The phone he had smashed. It hadn't been some act of teenage defiance. It had been the hospital trying to reach a daughter about her injured mother. He turned slowly to face the class, his face ashen. The memory of Michaela's tears took on a whole new meaning now. While he had been teaching her a lesson about respect and authority, she had been cut off from urgent news about her mother. The righteousness that had fueled his actions the day before crumbled into dust, leaving behind nothing but shame. He looked at Michaela's empty desk again, remembering how she had sat there crying silently, probably worried sick about why the hospital would be calling, unable to find out because he had destroyed her only means of communication. His legs felt weak and he sank into his chair. The students watched him with wary eyes, the room so quiet he could hear the tick of the clock on the wall. For the first time in his teaching career, Mr. Warner had no words, no lecture about discipline or respect to give. All he had was the crushing weight of knowing what he had done. The rest of the school day passed in a blur for Mr. Warner. Every class he taught felt mechanical, his words hollow as his mind kept drifting back to Michaela. During his free period, he sat at his desk, staring at the spot where the broken pieces of her phone had scattered across the floor. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through paperwork, unable to focus on the words before him. The image of Michaela's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, kept flashing through his mind. He had mistaken her distress for mere teenage defiance. How wrong he had been. "They need to learn respect," he muttered to himself, echoing the words he'd used countless times before. But they rang false now, empty justifications that crumbled under the weight of what he'd done. During lunch, he overheard more snippets of conversation in the teacher's lounge. "Poor Michaela," someone was saying. "She didn't get to the hospital until evening." Each word felt like a physical blow to his chest. Back in his classroom, he found himself glancing at Michaela's empty seat between lessons. The guilt that had started as a small prick that morning had grown into an overwhelming ache. He thought about all the times he'd prided himself on maintaining strict discipline, on never showing weakness. Now those memories felt tainted. His hands shook as he wrote on the chalkboard, his usually precise handwriting becoming unsteady. A student asked him if he was feeling okay, and he barely managed to nod. The truth was, he didn't feel okay at all. The knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing hour. During his last class of the day, he caught himself mid-sentence during a lecture about responsibility. The irony of it made him pause, his voice trailing off as he realized how his own actions had been anything but responsible. He had let his anger control him, had acted out of pride rather than wisdom. The faces of his students blurred before him as tears threatened to form in his eyes, something that hadn't happened in his classroom in over 20 years of teaching. He turned quickly to the board, pretending to write something down while he collected himself. Control, discipline, respect, he had always preached. But what kind of respect had he shown Michaela? What kind of discipline had he really displayed by losing his temper so completely? The questions haunted him, making his chest tight with remorse. The guilt becomes revenge for him, a mental weight that grows as he realizes his failure to see students as individuals with struggles and stories beyond his classroom. As Mr. Warner drove home that evening, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The setting sun cast long shadows across the road, but his mind was far from the drive. Instead, he kept seeing Michaela's phone shatter against the floor, hearing the gasps of shocked students, and feeling the burning shame that now accompanied those memories. He pulled into his driveway but didn't get out of the car right away. Sitting there in the growing darkness, other faces began to surface in his mind. Tommy Peterson, who he'd sent to detention last month for being late 3 days in a row. He'd later learned the boy's father had lost his job, and Tommy had been helping his mother with early morning cleaning jobs. Sarah Martinez, who he'd berated for falling asleep in class, not knowing she'd been staying up nights caring for her sick grandmother. "I never asked," he whispered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. "I never even asked why." The weight of these realizations pressed against his chest. For years, he'd worn his reputation for strictness like a badge of honor. He'd seen himself as the teacher who maintained order, who prepared students for the real world by showing them that actions had consequences. But now those memories felt different, tainted by his newfound understanding. He remembered how he'd stand at the front of his classroom, arms crossed, face stern, watching for any sign of disobedience. How many times had he mistaken pain for defiance? How many struggles had he ignored in his rigid pursuit of discipline? Inside his house, Mr. Warner sank into his favorite armchair, but found no comfort in its familiar embrace. On his living room wall hung his Teacher of the Year award from 5 years ago. He'd always looked at it with pride, but tonight it seemed to mock him. What kind of teacher destroys a student's property? What kind of teacher lets his anger override his judgment? The scene with Michaela played again in his mind, but this time he saw it differently. He saw her hesitation before raising her hand, the fear in her eyes, the trembling of her lips as she tried to explain. He'd been so focused on maintaining his authority that he'd missed all the signs that something was seriously wrong, that she needed understanding, not punishment. "They're just kids," he muttered, running his hands over his face. "They're just kids trying their best to navigate their worlds." The simple truth of this statement hit him hard, making his throat tight with emotion. All these years he'd been so focused on molding his students into what he thought they should be, he'd forgotten to see who they already were. Young people with complex lives, real struggles, and stories he'd never bothered to learn. The next morning, Mr. Warner arrived at school earlier than usual. The empty hallways echoed with his footsteps as he made his way to his classroom, his shoulders heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He paused at Michaela's empty desk, running his fingers along its smooth surface. Opening his lesson planner, he stared at the carefully structured schedule he'd mapped out for the semester. Every minute was accounted for, every rule clearly defined, but nowhere in those rigid plans was there room for understanding or compassion. "I need to fix this," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet classroom. But how? The damage he'd done couldn't be erased with a simple apology. He'd not only destroyed Michaela's phone, but possibly prevented her from being with her mother during a critical moment. Mr. Warner sat at his desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and began writing what he might say to Michaela. Each attempt ended up crumpled in his wastebasket. Everything sounded hollow, insufficient. "I'm sorry" seemed painfully inadequate for the harm he'd caused. His eyes drifted to the disciplinary referral forms on his desk, the ones he'd filled out so frequently over the years. How many times had he used these as his first response instead of taking the time to listen? The thought made his stomach churn. During his free period, Mr. Warner walked to the guidance counselor's office. Mrs. Chen looked up in surprise. In 15 years, he'd never voluntarily sought her advice about a student. "I need help," he admitted, his voice catching slightly. "I've made a terrible mistake, and I don't know how to make it right." As he explained what had happened, Mrs. Chen listened without judgment, though he could see the concern in her eyes. When he finished, she leaned forward in her chair. "James," she said gently, using his first name, "the fact that you're here shows you're ready to change. But making amends isn't just about apologizing. It's about showing you understand why your actions were wrong and demonstrating that you're committed to doing better." Her words struck him deeply. All these years he'd been so certain of his methods, so convinced that strict discipline was the key to successful teaching. Now, sitting in Mrs. Chen's office, he felt like a student himself, one who had failed an important life lesson. Back in his classroom, Mr. Warner began to look at his teaching materials with new eyes. His rigid lesson plans, his strict rules, his zero-tolerance policies. They all seemed cold and impersonal now. How many students had he failed to truly see? How many opportunities for understanding had he missed in his quest for perfect order? The question of how to approach Michaela weighed heavily on his mind. He knew he needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to show her, and all his students, that he was capable of change. But the prospect terrified him. For the first time in his teaching career, Mr. Warner felt completely lost. After his last class of the day, Mr. Warner noticed two of Michaela's closest friends, Sarah and Jenny, gathering their books. His heart pounding, he cleared his throat. "Sarah, Jenny, could you stay for a moment?" The girls exchanged nervous glances. They lingered by their desks, keeping their distance from his desk at the front of the room. "How?" Mr. Warner's voice cracked slightly. He tried again, softer this time. "How is Michaela doing?" Sarah clutched her textbook tighter to her chest. "Fine, sir," she answered curtly, not meeting his eyes. "And her mother?" he pressed gently. "Is there any news about her condition?" Jenny shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "We're not really supposed to talk about it," she mumbled, staring at the floor. The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Warner could feel their reluctance, their distrust. These were students who usually participated eagerly in class discussions, but now they could barely look at him. "I understand you're worried about your friend," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I am too. I made a terrible mistake, and I'd like to make it right somehow." Sarah's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment he saw a flash of anger there. "You broke her phone," she said quietly. She couldn't even call her dad to tell him what happened. She had to borrow someone else's phone in the office. The words hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't even considered that detail, how his actions had affected Michaela's ability to reach her other parent. "If you really want to know how she's doing," Jenny added, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe you should check yourself, sir." The girls turned to leave, their movements quick and purposeful. At the doorway, Sarah paused. "She trusted you, Mr. Warner. We all did." Then they were gone, leaving him alone with the weight of their words. Mr. Warner sank into his chair, the students' guarded responses and subtle accusations echoing in his mind. He had hoped to find some way to reach out to Michaela, but instead, he'd only confirmed how deeply his actions had affected not just her, but the trust of all his students. The next morning, Mr. Warner found himself in the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital, gripping his steering wheel with sweaty palms. He had asked the school secretary which hospital Michaela's mother was in, making up an excuse about needing to send some schoolwork. Now that he was here, his courage began to falter. "Just go in," he whispered to himself, trying to summon the strength. After several deep breaths, he finally stepped out of his car. The hospital lobby was bustling with activity. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights made him feel even more nervous as he approached the information desk. His voice trembled slightly as he asked for Mrs. Simpson's room. "Fourth floor, waiting room B," the receptionist said, barely looking up from her computer. The elevator ride felt endless. Mr. Warner's reflection in the polished metal doors showed a man he barely recognized, tired eyes, slumped shoulders, and worry lines creasing his forehead. When the doors opened, he followed the signs to waiting room B, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Just before reaching the waiting room, he slowed down. Through the large window, he could see several people seated inside. His heart clenched when he spotted Michaela. She was curled up in one of the chairs, wearing an oversized sweater that made her look even smaller than usual. An older man who must have been her father sat beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Mr. Warner took a step closer, hovering just outside the entrance. He watched as Michaela leaned against her father, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The sight made his chest ache with guilt. Mr. Warner stood frozen, his planned apology dying in his throat. The physical distance between them seemed to mirror the emotional gulf he had created with his actions. He watched as Michaela whispered something to her father, who glanced toward the door with a questioning look. Shame washed over Mr. Warner in waves. He had no right to be here, to intrude on their family's private pain. His presence was clearly causing Michaela more distress, and that was the last thing she needed right now. As Mr. Warner drove home from the hospital, his mind raced with thoughts of how to make things right. The usual methods, a simple apology or replacing the phone, seemed hollow given the magnitude of his actions. He needed to do something more meaningful. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, researching Michaela's family. Local news articles revealed that Mrs. Simpson was deeply involved in community service, particularly with the town's food bank. Several stories showed pictures of her and Michaela working side by side, sorting donations and preparing care packages for families in need. "Like mother, like daughter," he murmured, reading about how Michaela had started a student volunteer program at the food bank last year. The program had helped dozens of families, but since Mrs. Simpson's accident, it had been put on hold. Mr. Warner's hands trembled as he clicked through more articles. Each one painted a picture of a family dedicated to helping others. He found himself blinking back tears as he read about Michaela organizing a winter coat drive for elementary school children. "This is it," he whispered, straightening up in his chair. He could restart Michaela's volunteer program but make it bigger. He could involve the whole school, create a lasting legacy that would honor both Michaela and her mother. Mr. Warner spent the next few hours drafting a proposal. His usually neat handwriting became messy with excitement as he outlined plans for a school-wide community service initiative. Students would receive credit for volunteer hours, and the program would be named after Mrs. Simpson. As he worked, tears occasionally blurred his vision. For the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about rules or discipline. Instead, he was thinking about compassion, community, and the kind of teacher he should have been all along. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling pages with ideas: weekly food bank visits, clothing drives, tutoring programs for younger students. All the things Michaela and her mother had championed. The program would ensure their work continued even while Mrs. Simpson recovered. "It's not enough," he said softly, looking at his pages of notes. "But it's a start." The next morning, Mr. Warner arrived at school early, clutching a thick manila envelope. Inside was not only his community service program proposal, but also the paperwork for a fundraising initiative he'd stayed up late arranging. He'd contacted the hospital's social services department and set up a medical expense fund for Mrs. Simpson. His hands shook slightly as he stood before his first period class. The students watched him warily, the tension from recent events still hanging heavy in the air. He cleared his throat and looked at Michaela's empty desk before addressing the room. "I have something important to share with you all today," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about our community and how we can make our school a more supportive place." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I'd like to propose creating a healing garden here on campus." The students stirred in their seats, exchanging curious glances. Mr. Warner pulled out some sketches he'd made the night before. "This would be a peaceful space," he continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "where anyone can go to think, to reflect, or simply find some quiet during difficult times. It would have benches, flowers, and a small fountain." He gestured to the drawings. "And with Principal Anderson's approval, we'd like to dedicate it to Mrs. Simpson, who has done so much for our community." He noticed some students sitting up straighter, their expressions shifting from wariness to interest. A few even smiled tentatively. "This won't just be my project," Mr. Warner explained, walking between the desks. "I'd like all of you to be involved. We'll need help with planning, planting, and maintaining the garden. Each of you can contribute in your own way." He placed the sketches on an empty desk near the front of the room. "The garden will be located in the courtyard near the library. It'll be a place where everyone can find peace, especially during tough times." His voice grew quieter. "Sometimes we all need a space to heal." The classroom remained silent, but it was different from the fearful silence he was used to commanding. This silence felt contemplative, almost hopeful. Several students were now leaning forward in their seats, examining the drawings with genuine interest. "I've already spoken with the school board about funding, and they've approved an initial budget," he added. "But I've also set up a separate fund at St. Mary's Hospital to help support families in our school community who are facing medical challenges." He didn't explicitly mention Mrs. Simpson's name, but the students understood the connection. A hand went up in the back of the class. "When can we start?" asked Sarah, one of Michaela's closest friends. For the first time in days, Mr. Warner felt a glimmer of hope. "We can begin planning today," he replied, "right after our lesson." The next day during lunch break, Mr. Warner stood in the classroom where he'd set up the garden planning meeting. For the first 15 minutes, he sat alone at his desk, his heart sinking as he watched the clock tick by. Finally, Sarah and 2 other students tentatively entered the room, keeping their distance as they took seats near the back. "I wasn't sure anyone would come," Mr. Warner admitted, his voice gentle. "Thank you for being here." The students exchanged uncertain glances. Sarah pulled out a notebook but didn't open it, fidgeting with the spiral binding instead. "Maybe we could start by sharing some ideas," Mr. Warner suggested, moving to sit at a student desk rather than standing at the front of the room. "What would make this garden special to you?" At first, nobody spoke. Then Tommy, a quiet boy who rarely participated in class, raised his hand halfway. "My grandmother had a garden with these purple flowers that attracted butterflies," he said softly. "It was always peaceful there." "Butterfly bushes," Sarah added, finally opening her notebook. "And maybe we could add some benches under a pergola? For shade?" As they talked, more students began trickling in. Julie brought up the idea of a small pond with water lilies. Marcus suggested installing wind chimes. Each new suggestion seemed to encourage more participation, and Mr. Warner found himself taking notes rather than directing the conversation. "What if we made the paths curve instead of straight lines?" suggested Rachel, approaching the whiteboard. "Like this?" She sketched a gentle, winding pathway. Mr. Warner watched as the students gathered around the board, adding to Rachel's drawing. Their initial reluctance was melting away as they became more invested in the project. When Emma suggested painting rocks with inspirational messages to line the paths, several students pulled out their phones to show examples they'd seen online. "These are wonderful ideas," Mr. Warner said, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "This is becoming more beautiful than anything I could have planned on my own." The students looked at him with less apprehension now, some even offering small smiles. As they continued planning, Mr. Warner found himself stepping back, watching as the students took ownership of the project. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and he realized that by letting go of control, he was witnessing something far more meaningful than his original vision. By the end of lunch period, the whiteboard was covered with drawings and lists, and the students had naturally organized themselves into committees for different aspects of the garden. Mr. Warner noticed that even some students who normally kept to themselves were volunteering for tasks, drawn in by the collaborative spirit that had developed. As the students worked on clearing the garden space during their lunch breaks, Mr. Warner found himself doing something he'd never done before: listening. Really listening. He knelt beside Marcus, helping to pull stubborn weeds from the soil. The boy's hands were practiced, knowing exactly how to grip the roots. "My mom and I used to garden together," Marcus said quietly, not looking up. "Before she got sick. Some days now, she's too tired to even come outside, but she can see this spot from her bedroom window." Mr. Warner's hands stilled in the dirt. He remembered how he'd scolded Marcus last month for falling asleep in class. The boy had been working nights at a local grocery store, he learned now, trying to help with the medical bills. Sarah joined them, carrying garden stakes for the butterfly bushes. "My sister would have loved this," she said, arranging them in a circle. "She used to collect butterflies. Not real ones, just pictures and stuff. Before the accident." Mr. Warner remembered giving Sarah detention for being late 3 times in 1 week. He hadn't known she was struggling to get her younger siblings to school first, stepping into her sister's role. During their planning sessions, more stories emerged. Tommy talked about living with his grandmother because his parents were deployed overseas. Julie shared how she practiced dance in the park because there was no space at the shelter where she and her mom were staying temporarily. Each revelation hit Mr. Warner like a physical blow. These weren't just students who needed discipline. They were young people carrying burdens he'd never bothered to see. His strict rules and harsh reactions hadn't been teaching them responsibility. They'd been adding weight to already heavy loads. One afternoon, while helping Emma plant bulbs, she suddenly said, "You know, Michaela used to help her mom at the community center every weekend. They ran this art program for kids who couldn't afford classes." She patted the soil gently around a daffodil bulb. "That's why she always turned in her art projects late, but they were always really good." Mr. Warner sat back on his heels, remembering all the times he'd marked down Michaela's grades for tardiness without ever asking why. The shame of his rigidity, his refusal to see beyond the surface, settled deep in his chest. "I didn't know," he said softly, more to himself than to Emma. "I never knew any of this." Emma looked at him directly for the first time in weeks. "You never asked," she said simply, without accusation. "But you're asking now. That's something, right?" Mr. Warner sat on a bench near the developing garden, watching as parents and community members worked alongside his students. The once empty patch of land was transforming into something beautiful. Flowering shrubs lined the curved pathways, and hand-painted stones carried messages of hope and healing. His chest tightened as he observed the natural way everyone worked together. Parents chatted with students, sharing gardening tips and stories. Teachers stopped by during their breaks, rolling up their sleeves to help plant flowers or spread mulch. Even Principal Anderson had joined in, hauling bags of soil and offering encouragement to the volunteers. The scene before him was everything he'd never allowed in his classroom: warmth, connection, shared purpose. For years, he'd believed that maintaining strict control was the only way to teach effectively. Now, watching his students take leadership roles in the garden project, he saw how wrong he'd been. "They're quite remarkable, aren't they?" Mrs. Chen, the art teacher, said as she settled beside him on the bench. "Yesterday, I saw Tommy showing a group of younger students how to plant seedlings. Such patience he has." Mr. Warner nodded, remembering how he used to snap at Tommy for asking too many questions in class. "I've learned more about my students in the past few weeks than I have in all my years of teaching," he admitted quietly. "I kept them at arm's length, thinking it made me a better teacher. Instead, I missed seeing who they really are." His eyes drifted to the center of the garden where a small fountain was being installed. The students had chosen it specifically because Michaela's mother had always loved the sound of running water. The thought of Michaela brought fresh waves of regret. "I keep hoping she'll come," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want her to see that this isn't just a garden. It's an acknowledgement of everything I did wrong, everything I want to make right." Mrs. Chen patted his arm gently. "Change isn't easy, James. But what you're doing here, opening your heart to these students, that's real change. The garden is becoming more than just a memorial. It's becoming a symbol of growth for everyone involved. Mr. Warner watched as a group of students carefully planted a row of peace lilies. They worked with such care, such consideration for each plant. He thought about how he wished he'd shown that same care for his students' individual needs and circumstances. The garden was teaching him lessons he should have learned long ago, about patience, understanding, and the importance of nurturing growth rather than demanding perfection. The next morning, Mr. Warner's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his car in the hospital parking lot. Beside him on the passenger seat lay a wrapped box containing a new phone, the same model as the one he'd destroyed, and an envelope filled with the donations from the school community. Taking several deep breaths, he gathered his courage and made his way to the hospital entrance. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights made his nervousness even more acute as he walked down the corridor to room 215, where he'd learned Michaela's mother was recovering. He paused outside the door, his heart pounding. Through the small window, he could see Michaela sitting beside her mother's bed, reading from a book. Her mother looked pale but alert, propped up against several pillows. Before he could lose his nerve, he knocked softly. Both women looked up, and Mr. Warner saw Michaela stiffen. Her mother, however, gave a gentle smile and motioned for him to enter. "Mrs. Simpson," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "Michaela, I hope I'm not intruding." "Come in, Mr. Warner," Mrs. Simpson said weakly but kindly. He stepped into the room, clutching the wrapped box and envelope. He began, then had to clear his throat. "I came to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable, and I am deeply sorry for what I did." He turned to face Michaela directly. "I should never have reacted the way I did. I should have listened. I should have shown compassion." Tears welled in his eyes as he held out the wrapped box. "This isn't meant to make up for what I did. Nothing can. But I wanted to replace what I destroyed." Michaela hesitantly took the package, her eyes wide with surprise. Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand encouragingly. "And this," Mr. Warner continued, holding out the envelope with trembling fingers, "is from the school community. Everyone wanted to help with the medical expenses." Mrs. Simpson gasped softly as Michaela opened the envelope, revealing the substantial sum that had been collected. "Mr. Warner, we can't possibly—" "Please," he said quietly. "Everyone wanted to help. Your impact on our community has touched so many lives." Tears began rolling down Michaela's cheeks as she looked at her mother, then back at Mr. Warner. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. The garden, this—" She gestured to the gifts. "It means a lot." Mrs. Simpson reached out and took Mr. Warner's hand. "Thank you for showing my daughter that people can change, that they can acknowledge their mistakes and work to make things right. That's a valuable lesson for everyone." After a few days, the morning of the garden dedication ceremony dawned bright and clear. Mr. Warner stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. His hands shook slightly as he smoothed down his jacket and checked his speech cards one more time. The garden had transformed a neglected corner of the schoolyard into something beautiful. Students had planted flowering shrubs, installed benches, and created a small fountain. A hand-painted sign reading "Healing Garden" waited under a cloth, ready to be unveiled. As Mr. Warner walked toward the gathering crowd, his stomach churned with anxiety. He scanned the faces, looking for Michaela. Principal Anderson was there, along with several teachers and what seemed like half the student body, but no sign of Michaela yet. "Everything's ready, Mr. Warner," said Tommy, one of the student volunteers, gesturing to the podium they'd set up. Mr. Warner nodded, his throat tight. He pulled out his speech cards again, though he'd memorized every word. The speech felt heavy with the weight of public confession, but he knew it was necessary. His eyes kept darting to the parking lot, hoping to see Michaela arrive. Just as Principal Anderson stepped forward to begin the ceremony, Mr. Warner spotted movement at the edge of the crowd. His heart leaped. There was Michaela helping her mother from a car. Mrs. Simpson was still using a walker, but her smile was bright as she made her way slowly toward the gathering. Principal Anderson welcomed everyone and spoke briefly about community spirit. Then it was Mr. Warner's turn. His legs felt like lead as he approached the podium. Looking out at the crowd, he saw Michaela and her mother settle into chairs in the front row. "This garden," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "was born from a mistake. My mistake." He took a deep breath. "Many of you know what happened that day in my classroom. I let my pride and anger control my actions. I forgot the most important part of being a teacher, understanding that our students are human beings with lives and struggles beyond our classroom walls." Mr. Warner's voice grew stronger as he continued, though tears pricked at his eyes. "I've learned that true authority doesn't come from fear or control, but from compassion and understanding. This garden honors Mrs. Simpson, whose kindness and community service have touched so many lives. But it also stands as a reminder that we all have the capacity to change, to learn from our mistakes, and to become better people." He looked directly at Michaela as he spoke the next words. "I am not the same teacher I was before. My students have taught me more than I could ever teach them about empathy, forgiveness, and growth. This garden represents not just a place of peace, but a promise, my promise, to always listen first, to lead with understanding, and to remember that every student who walks into my classroom has a story that deserves to be heard." Tears glistened in several eyes as Mr. Warner continued his speech, his voice growing softer but more determined. "When I destroyed Michaela's phone that day, I wasn't just breaking a device. I was breaking trust. I was so focused on maintaining control that I forgot about being human." He paused, taking a shaky breath. The crowd remained silent, hanging on his every word. Several of his current students exchanged glances, seeing their strict teacher in a completely new light. "Mrs. Simpson," he said, turning to face Michaela's mother, "your dedication to our community, your kindness to others, and your spirit of volunteerism have taught me what true leadership looks like. It's not about enforcing rules. It's about lifting others up, showing compassion, and understanding that everyone faces battles we know nothing about." In the audience, Tommy, who had always been scared of Mr. Warner, wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Mia, another student known for being rebellious, sat straighter in her chair, visibly moved by her teacher's words. "This garden," Mr. Warner continued, gesturing to the beautiful space around them, "represents more than just flowers and benches. Each plant was chosen with care by students who wanted to create a space of peace. Every stone was placed by hands that understood the importance of healing. And the fountain," his voice cracked slightly, "the fountain's constant flow reminds us that change is always possible." He turned back to address the whole gathering, his eyes wet with emotion. "I've spent decades teaching from behind a wall of strict rules and harsh consequences. But Michaela's situation showed me that being a good teacher isn't about maintaining perfect order. It's about maintaining our humanity." Several of Mr. Warner's fellow teachers nodded in understanding, some reaching for tissues. Even Principal Anderson, standing to the side, appeared deeply touched by the transformation she was witnessing in her once rigid colleague. "The lessons I've learned from this experience will stay with me forever," Mr. Warner said, his voice growing stronger. "I've learned that true respect isn't demanded, it's earned through understanding and compassion. I've learned that sometimes the most important moments in our students' lives happen outside our classroom walls. And most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to become better than we were yesterday." Students who had once seen Mr. Warner as nothing more than a strict disciplinarian now saw someone different, someone vulnerable, someone real. The change in their expressions was visible as they watched their teacher bare his soul before them, acknowledging his mistakes and sharing his journey toward becoming a better person. Michaela rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly. The crowd fell completely silent as she made her way to the podium where Mr. Warner stood. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her posture showed strength and determination. "Mr. Warner," she began, her voice soft but clear, "that day in class changed everything for me. When you smashed my phone, you didn't just break a piece of technology. You broke something inside me, too." She paused, taking a deep breath. Mr. Warner stood quietly, accepting her words with visible remorse on his face. I felt so small that day, Michaela continued, her voice quivering. So humiliated. Everyone was watching, and I couldn't even explain why that call was so important. I missed precious time with my mom because of what happened, and for a while, I carried so much anger about that. Several students in the audience nodded, remembering that terrible day. Mr. Warner's shoulders slumped slightly as he listened to Michaela's words. But standing here today, seeing this garden, hearing your words, Michaela wiped a tear from her cheek. I see something different now. I see a teacher who made a mistake, yes, but also someone who had the courage to admit it and try to make things right. She turned to look at the garden with its peaceful paths and blooming flowers. This space isn't just about pretty flowers or quiet benches. It's about transformation. And Mr. Warner, I see how much you've changed. I see how you're different with other students now, how you listen more, how you try to understand. Mr. Warner's eyes welled up with tears as Michaela spoke. I accept your apology, she said firmly, and I want you to know that I understand now that teachers aren't perfect. You showed us that it's okay to make mistakes as long as we learn from them and try to do better. That's probably the most important lesson you've ever taught us. She managed a small smile through her tears. The Mr. Warner who smashed my phone that day wouldn't have created this garden. He wouldn't have visited my mom in the hospital or helped with the medical bills. He wouldn't have stood here and admitted his mistakes in front of everyone. But you did all those things, and that shows me who you really are. After Michaela's heartfelt speech, Mr. Warner sat alone in his classroom, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk. Her words echoed in his mind, especially about transformation. Though she had accepted his apology, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He pulled out his lesson planner, staring at the rigid schedule he'd maintained for years. Each minute was carefully allocated, focused entirely on academic achievement. There was no space for understanding who his students really were, what challenges they faced, or what dreams they carried. How many other stories have I missed, he whispered to himself, running his fingers through his graying hair. The weight of countless missed opportunities to connect with his students pressed heavily on his shoulders. Mr. Warner opened his drawer and took out a fresh notebook. With careful consideration, he began writing down the names of all his current students. Next to each name, he realized he knew so little, just grades and behavioral notes. Nothing about their lives, their struggles, or their hopes. His hand paused over Tommy Anderson's name, a student who often dozed off in class. In the past, Mr. Warner would have simply marked him down for sleeping. Now, he wondered if Tommy had responsibilities at home that kept him up late, or if there were other reasons for his fatigue. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Warner made a decision. He would start each class with 5 minutes of open discussion, letting students share whatever was on their minds. He would create connection cards, simple index cards where students could write about their lives if they wanted to share something privately. Looking at his classroom walls covered in academic achievements and strict rules, Mr. Warner stood up and began taking down some of the more severe-looking notices. In their place, he put up a new sign that read, "This is a space where we learn together, both teachers and students." His hands trembled slightly as he wrote out his new classroom mission: to create an environment where learning went beyond textbooks and tests, where understanding each other was just as important as understanding the subject matter. "I may never fully make up for what I did," he said quietly to himself, "but I can make sure I never make the same mistake again. Every student has a story, and it's time I started listening." The next morning, Mr. Warner arrived at school an hour earlier than usual. He settled at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee and spread out his materials: colorful sticky notes, index cards, and his trusty lesson planner. The morning sunlight streamed through the classroom windows as he began reimagining his teaching approach. He created what he called story circles, small group discussions where students could share their experiences in a safe space. He designed simple prompts like, "Share a challenge you faced this week," or "Tell us about someone who inspires you." These would replace the first few minutes of his usual grammar drills. Mr. Warner also developed a project called Life Beyond Lessons. Students would write weekly journal entries connecting their personal experiences to the literature they studied. For their current novel study of To Kill a Mockingbird, instead of just analyzing the text, students could reflect on times they'd witnessed or experienced injustice in their own lives. His hands moved quickly across paper as he sketched out a new seating arrangement. Rather than the traditional rows facing forward, he planned to arrange desks in small clusters, encouraging collaboration and conversation. Each group would rotate weekly, giving students chances to connect with different classmates. Getting to know you cards were next on his list. He designed simple templates where students could share their interests, family life, and dreams for the future. But unlike standard first day of school activities, these cards would be ongoing conversations. Students could update them throughout the year as their lives and aspirations changed. Mr. Warner paused, looking at his classroom walls. He cleared a large bulletin board and labeled it, "Our Stories Matter." This would be a space where students could voluntarily share photos, artwork, or writing that represented important moments in their lives. For homework assignments, he revised his standard essays into more personal projects. Instead of just writing book reports, students could create family history projects, interviewing relatives and connecting their stories to themes in literature. Rather than mechanical grammar exercises, they would write letters to people who had influenced their lives, practicing proper writing mechanics while expressing genuine feelings. The bell would ring soon and students would begin filing in. Mr. Warner stood back, surveying his work. The classroom felt different already, warmer, more inviting. His detailed plans sat ready on his desk, but more importantly, his heart felt ready for this new approach to teaching. He wasn't just preparing to teach English anymore. He was preparing to understand the young lives that would soon fill these seats. Michaela sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by colorful throw pillows as she scrolled through messages from her classmates. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through her bedroom window, and a gentle breeze rustled the curtains. Her friends had been texting her about all the changes happening at school, especially in Mr. Warner's class. "You wouldn't believe it, Mick," one message read. "He actually asked Sarah about her soccer tournament today. He remembered she had one this weekend." Another text showed a photo of their classroom's new setup, desks arranged in small groups instead of the rigid rows they'd sat in all year. The stark walls that once held only grammar rules were now covered with student artwork and writing. Michaela hugged a pillow to her chest, feeling a mix of emotions wash over her. The memory of that terrible day, the sound of her phone shattering, the helplessness she felt not knowing about her mother's accident, still brought a twinge of pain. But something else was growing alongside that hurt. A sense of wonder at how much Mr. Warner had changed. She thought about his letter tucked away in her desk drawer. His words had been raw and honest, admitting to his fears and failures. The scholarship fund he'd created in her mother's name would help other students for years to come. And now, hearing how he was transforming his classroom into a place of understanding and connection, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. But these were different from the ones she'd shed before. Rolling onto her side, Michaela picked up the framed photo from her bedside table. It showed her mother volunteering at the local food bank, her warm smile radiating kindness. "Mom always said people can change if we give them the chance," she whispered to herself, running her finger along the frame's edge. The weight she'd been carrying, the anger, the hurt, the resentment, began to feel lighter. Not because what happened didn't matter anymore, but because she could see how that painful moment had sparked real transformation. Mr. Warner wasn't just saying sorry. He was becoming a different kind of teacher, the kind who saw his students as whole people with lives and struggles beyond the classroom walls. Michaela took a deep breath, feeling something settle in her heart. She realized that forgiving Mr. Warner didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. Instead, it meant acknowledging that people can learn from their mistakes and truly change. Her mother had always taught her that forgiveness was as much about freeing yourself as it was about the other person. Picking up her new phone, Michaela began typing a message to Mr. Warner. She wanted to tell him that while the past couldn't be erased, she saw and appreciated his efforts to become better. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she carefully chose her words, ready to take this step toward healing. The following Monday, Mr. Warner sat across from Michaela in his classroom after school hours. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. They had agreed to meet to discuss an idea that had been forming in both their minds. "I've been thinking," Michaela began, her voice steady and confident, "about how many other students might be going through tough times that teachers don't know about." Mr. Warner nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And after everything that happened, I realize how important it is to create a space where students feel safe sharing their struggles." Together, they began sketching out plans for a new program called Bridge the Gap. It would be a weekly meeting where students could speak openly about their challenges, with teachers serving as mentors rather than authority figures. The idea was simple but powerful, creating an environment of trust and understanding. "We could have different themes each week," Michaela suggested, warming to the idea, like dealing with family illness, academic pressure, or just feeling overwhelmed. Mr. Warner watched as she outlined her thoughts, amazed at how his former quiet student had become such a confident voice for change. "What if we invited other teachers to join as mentors? They could share their own experiences too." The program took shape quickly. They set up comfortable chairs in a circle in the school library, created simple guidelines that emphasized confidentiality and respect, and made colorful posters to hang in the hallways. Word spread through the school and soon students began showing up. First just a few, then more and more. During these sessions, Mr. Warner found himself transformed. Instead of standing at the front of a room delivering lectures, he sat among the students, listening to their stories with genuine interest and offering gentle guidance when needed. His reputation shifted from being the strict disciplinarian to becoming someone students trusted with their concerns. "It's amazing to see how many students just needed someone to listen," Michaela remarked one afternoon as they cleaned up after a particularly moving session. A sophomore had shared her struggles with anxiety, and several others had opened up about similar experiences. Mr. Warner smiled, remembering how he used to think discipline alone could solve every problem. "You taught me that, Michaela. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is simply be there for each other." The program became a model for other schools in the district. Teachers began approaching Mr. Warner for advice on connecting with their students, and he shared his journey from rigid authority figure to compassionate mentor. Each week, more students found their way to the meetings, knowing they would find understanding and support. On a crisp spring morning, Michaela approached Mr. Warner after a Bridge the Gap session. Her eyes were bright with purpose as she held out a small potted flower, a beautiful pink peony, her mother's favorite. "Mr. Warner," she said softly, "would you help me plant this in the healing garden? Mom always said peonies represent healing and compassion." Mr. Warner's breath caught in his throat. He carefully took the pot, cradling it as if it were made of glass. "I'd be honored," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. That afternoon, a small group gathered in the healing garden, Michaela's family, several students, and faculty members. The garden had flourished since its creation, with colorful blooms and peaceful pathways creating a sanctuary on the school grounds. Michaela led Mr. Warner to a special spot near the garden center. Together, they knelt by the prepared soil. Mr. Warner's hands trembled slightly as he helped dig the hole, remembering how far they'd come from that terrible day in his classroom. "Mom would have loved this garden," Michaela said, her voice gentle as she helped position the peony. She always believed in second chances and the power of forgiveness. As they patted the soil around the plant's base, Mr. Warner felt tears welling in his eyes. The simple act of planting this flower alongside Michaela felt profound, a symbol of growth, healing, and new beginnings. Standing back, Mr. Warner looked at the garden surrounding them. Students sat on benches, chatting quietly or studying. Others walked the paths, finding peace in this space that had grown from his greatest mistake. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground, and in that moment, Mr. Warner felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He glanced at Michaela, who was smiling at the newly planted peony, and realized that through making amends, he had discovered his true calling as an educator. Not as an enforcer of rules, but as a guide and mentor who could help students navigate life's challenges with compassion and understanding. If you enjoyed the story of Mr. Warner and Michaela, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.